The badge they gave me said Observer, Courtesy Tier. It was blue. The researchers wore green. I noticed that on my first morning at the Orithval Research Cooperative and didn't say anything about it because there wasn't anything to say. That was the tier I'd been assigned. I was a third-year agricultural exchange student from small university on a planet that most of the Solvith Cooperative had never heard of, and I had arrived carrying a field notebook, a worn copy of companion planning tables I'd made myself, and 17 months of summer work in my grandfather's grain operation outside Breskine. None of that, apparently, qualified as research. The orientation was brief. A Solvith administrator, tall, translucent pale, the light under his skin pulsing faint gold when he was pleased and going flat when he wasn't. Walked me through the station in about 12 minutes. 40 decks of hydroponic substrate, growing food crops for 6 joint species transit stations. An impressive undertaking. He showed me the observation gallery, a glassed-in mezzanine level above the main grow floors, with seating and a display panel that updated yield metrics every 6 hours. He told me I was welcome to observe at any time, that I'd be included in weekly briefings as a courtesy, and that if I had questions, I should submit them through the exchange office in writing. Your Earth agricultural background will give you an interesting comparative frame, he said. The light under his skin did not change at all when he said it. I thanked him and went to find my seat in the gallery. The Solvith are extraordinary researchers. I want to be clear about that. The substrate systems they'd built were elegant. Multi-layer growing columns, automated mineral supplementation, humidity, cycling calibrated to within 0.1%. Their data collection was meticulous. They ran controlled trials on 46 crop varieties simultaneously and cross-referenced the outputs against 612 variables. Watching the grow floor from the gallery was like watching a very precise machine that had been tuned by people who understood every part of it. Except it wasn't working. I figured that out by the end of my first week. The yield metrics on the display panel showed a slow, grinding decline across nearly all columns. Not a collapse, not a crisis, just a steady drift downward that had apparently been going on for 11 months. The researchers knew about it. I heard it mentioned at the weekly briefing, which I attended from a seat in the back. The current working theory, as of that briefing, was a mineral calibration drift in the supplementation system. They were running a full audit. I looked at the yield curves on my display panel and thought about something else. I kept thinking about it over the next 2 weeks. I had a lot of time to think because the gallery was quiet and my notebook was full of blank pages and no one came up to the mezzanine except a maintenance tech twice a week to wipe the display panels. I wrote down what I was seeing. I've been watching the metrics long enough to get a feel for the shape of the problem, and the shape didn't match mineral drift. Mineral drift is uniform. It spreads across systems evenly, follows the supplementation schedule. What I was watching wasn't uniform at all. The substrate columns weren't failing uniformly. They were failing in a pattern, cycling through sections in a sequence that didn't match anything mineral-related. The columns that had been in heaviest rotation for the longest stretches were the ones deepest in decline. The newest columns, recently brought online, were holding fine. I knew that pattern. I'd grown up watching it. The Solvith substrate isn't soil. It's a nutrient delivery medium, engineered, nothing like dirt. But the principle underneath, it is the same one my grandfather had explained to me when I was 9 years old, standing in a field that had been planted with the same crop for 4 straight seasons. The substrate was tired. It wasn't depleted exactly. The supplementation system was keeping the mineral levels correct, but the fixation architecture had been overloaded. The columns had been running continuous nitrogen fixing cycles without any rest interval, and the substrate's biological processing capacity had essentially locked up. The nutrients were present. The plants couldn't access them. On Earth, we call it nitrogen lockout. We've known about it for a very long time. The fix is rotation and rest. You pull the load off the affected columns for a cycle, run a low-demand cover crop or nothing at all, let the substrate recover its processing balance. It takes about 4 days. I wrote all of this down in my notebook. I did not submit it through the exchange office because submitting questions in writing and waiting for them to move through a bureaucratic review process seemed like the wrong format for what I'd found, And also, I wasn't certain enough in my diagnosis to want it attached to my name in an official filing. What I'd done essentially was sit in a gallery and notice something from the outside. The researchers had 612 variables, and I had one notebook and a pattern I recognized from grain fields in Breskine. It seemed presumptuous, so I watched. Over the following weeks, the mineral audit came back clean. The research team moved on to a substrate composition hypothesis, ran trials, found nothing. They brought in a supplementation specialist from another station. He ran additional trials. The yield curves kept drifting. At the weekly briefings, the light under the administrator's skin stayed flat. I wrote nitrogen lockout, cycle rest in my notebook about once a week, circled it, and turned the page. My exchange placement ran for 3 months. On the last morning, I packed my field notebook and my companion planning tables and went down to the grow floor to return my blue badge. The administrator was there, reviewing something on a data panel near the main column array. He looked up when I approached, pulsed a brief courtesy gold, and held out his hand for the badge. I gave it to him. Then I said, the substrate columns in sections 7 through 14, the ones deepest in decline. I think it's nitrogen lockout. The fixation cycles haven't had a rest interval in over a year. If you pull the load for 4 days and run a passive recovery cycle, the access capacity should restore. He looked at me for a moment. The light under his skin did a thing I hadn't seen before, a brief flicker, amber, not quite gold and not quite flat. That's a very simple mechanism, he said. Yes, I said. Our substrate is not soil. No, I said. But the fixation architecture behaves similarly under sustained load. The nutrient levels are fine. The processing pathway is saturated. I paused. It's something we see in grain rotations. The fix is usually straightforward. He looked at the column array. He looked at me. He said he would pass the observation to the research team. I thanked him and left. I found out later, through the exchange office, that the recovery trial ran 4 days after my departure. Full passive rest cycle on sections 7 through 14. Yield metrics in those sections improved 31% in the first week and reached projected baseline by the end of the month. The other sections, still running continuous fixation cycles, continued their slow decline until the rest protocol was extended station-wide. Full yield recovery took 6 weeks. The formal exchange report from the Orithval Research Cooperative, filed with my university, read as follows. Exchange candidate Petra Vaz completed a 3-month observational placement. Candidate demonstrated attentive presence and professional conduct. No formal research contributions were recorded during the placement period. Recommend standard courtesy academic credit. There was an appendix. It was a single paragraph. It noted that a corrective maintenance observation provided by the exchange candidate on the final day of placement had been evaluated by the research team and implemented as a trial protocol. It noted that the trial had produced significant yield improvement across affected substrate sections. It noted that the underlying mechanism was under review for incorporation into standard substrate management guidelines. The classification field at the bottom of Appendix A read, pending. I keep the exchange report in a drawer. I don't show it to people. There's nothing much to show. It's a bureaucratic document that says I was present and polite and then, as an afterthought, fixed something that 11 months of meticulous research had not. The Solvith didn't do anything wrong. They're excellent researchers. They just didn't ask the farmer. My grandfather would have found the whole thing mildly entertaining. He'd grown up watching that same lockout pattern cycle through every operation in the region that planted too hard and rested too little. He knew the fix before he was 12. Some things look complicated from the outside. From inside a grain field in Breskine, standing in dirt you've been reading since you could walk, they're just Tuesday.